presidential candidate Ron Paul. And for all his hard work for the students for Ron Paul, and I appreciate that very much. I appreciate the numbers that have come out. He said we could get a couple hundred. Yeah, but look, wow. Now, also would like to introduce that young lady that I married 55 years ago, Carol. And this is Linda, the company, that's all I'm sure. So the important issue to talk about, it's not very complicated. I guess we could have a lot of words to describe what we're trying to do, but I settled for one word, and that is liberty. And if we come around to understand where liberty comes from and what the responsibility of government is, I think that will result in the best chance of having peace and prosperity throughout the world. But our country today is no longer the country it was a few years back or a few decades back. It certainly isn't the republic that was intended by the Constitution. We no longer have a Republican form of government. And the founders were very adamant about it. They talked about a republic versus a pure democracy, and they had very bad feelings about a pure democracy where the 51% could gang up on the minority and dictate the rules of economics or the rules of personal behavior on the minority. And I'm afraid that's where we are today. But the spirit is alive. Let me tell you, in this country, more and more people now are waking up. The people like you are wide awake. You know what's wrong. You know what has to be done. Washington is sound asleep. What we need to do is make sure they hear us and make sure they know what the message is, and that is for liberty. Approximately 100 years ago, we embarked on a different direction. We virtually gave up on the Constitution, and it's been whittled away constantly ever since. And even in the last few years, it's gotten much worse. In spite of the people waking up and wanting something different, we still have a job cut out for ourselves, because Washington isn't hearing us, and they have not changed, but we will make a difference. We will make sure they hear this message. Especially under the Woodrow Wilson administration, things certainly started in the wrong direction. Foreign policy was changed, accepting this so-called idealism of making the world safe for democracy. And look at the last 100 years. It hasn't been very safe. A lot of people have died, and there's less freedom in the world today, and there's less freedom in this country. Also, a few other things occurred in 1913, a couple things that we should reverse. One, for instance, is the 16th Amendment. I'd like to reverse it. I'd like to repeal it. If we understand truly the Jeffersonian approach to saying that, our life and our liberty comes from our Creator, the consequence ought to be that the fruits of our labor ought to be our own and not the government's. But also there was one other item that they passed in 1913, and every once in a while I mention it, that was the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. I'd like to repeal that as well. It will come. It will come. If we can't do it quickly, they'll do it to themselves. They'll self-destruct. But you know, they have their anniversary coming up. It'll be 100 years old next year. So I think for the 100th anniversary, what we ought to do is repeal the Federal Reserve Act. That's it. A lot of people ask me, why do you talk about this money system all the time and the Federal Reserve and concentrating on sound money and the Constitution? Isn't that so old-fashioned? Well, the founders knew something about this. They suffered through the inflation of the continental dollar. There was total destruction of the continental money, and therefore they didn't want it to happen to us. They wanted to protect it, so they put in the Constitution only gold and silver could be legal tender, and that you could not print paper money, and that you don't have authority to start a central bank. So we've sort of violated that a bit. They didn't amend the Constitution. They just totally ignore it. We now today have a unit of account called a Federal Reserve note, and they all sometimes refer to it as a dollar. But if you ask them, define a dollar, they have no idea how to define a dollar. They say, well, it means it's a Federal Reserve note. So they're trying to protect the value of something they don't even know what is, and they can't even define it. Then they wonder why they have a mess in Washington and around the world. The dollar and the money issue is so important because it's 1/2 of everything we transact, whether you're measuring wages or prices or incomes or interest rates. It's all measured by this dollar that you can't define, and then they wonder how we got into this mess. But the whole problem, starting in 1913, was to establish a growth path for big government. You know, whether it was the income tax. Unfortunately, Jefferson lost the argument at the beginning of our country when he argued we shouldn't even be able to borrow. But we've been able to borrow all this time. So they also then said, well, taxes are limited because the people will rebel. The market limits borrowing because the interest rates will go too high. So that's why we had to have a central bank, because if we come up short, the federal government can always take their bills and their debt and send it to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve just prints the money. It sounds good, sounds like a good thing, especially if it works, and it worked for a while. It works for a while until the country gets too much in debt. And even 20, 30 years ago, the debt wasn't that outrageous. But we were a creditor nation. We were on the positive side, even during the Depression. Today, we are the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world. And they think the solution is spend more money and print more money. It's virtual insanity to think you can get out of trouble by doing the mistakes that have brought on the trouble. That's why we have to think about monetary policy, listen to the founders, and say, take away the power of the government and the Federal Reserve to create money out of thin air to finance wars. Is a moral and a constitutional issue, but it's also very much of a government issue, government growth issue. Because it accommodates and it hides the bills for a while, governments can grow. So certainly, look at 1913 on. The entitlement system developed, the warmongering developed. Quickly after the Federal Reserve came into effect, they financed World War I. We had the Depression in 1920-21. That depression lasted only 1 year because they weren't compelled by Keynesian economic theory to prolong the agony by propping up all the bad debt. There were no bailouts. So that depression ended the year. But by 1930, when the next depression came, Keynesian economics took over and said, they're too big to fail. We can't let them fail. We're good managers of the economy. Economic planning works, and we can get out of it. What did they do? They gave us a depression that lasted 17 years. And you'd think that would wake the people up, but it hasn't. They argued the case back then that the reason that we had a depression was because of the gold standard and also because of free markets. Well, that was absolutely wrong, but it was taught in our schools for decades and decades. But right now, the proof is out on the table that their policies have failed. The welfare state, the entitlement system, the inflation system, and the constant wars is a failed system, and it's ruining our country. We have to reverse that direction. Little thing that could have been done if we had only been able to send men and women to Washington that understood the Constitution and promised and lived up to their promises and obeyed the Constitution, we would not have the problems that we have today. Now, if that was the cause of our problem, why wouldn't the solution be make sure we send nobody to Washington, House, Senate, or the presidency that doesn't understand the Constitution, and you believe them when they make a promise that they will obey the Constitution? But over these many years, government has constantly grown, and therefore the attack on our personal liberties have been constant and steady. The economy now is in shambles because of constant debt, and there's no recognition that the correction for constant debt is liquidation of debt. Get rid of the debt. If you got into trouble and had too much debt, or your business had too much debt, you couldn't have economic growth if your credit ran out unless you got rid of your debt. You'd have to work harder and pay off your debt, get new jobs, or live, more cautiously and live within your means. A country that lives over its means for a long time will be destined to live beneath its means, and that is what's happening right now. The country is poorer because everything is based on debt, and this is the reason the middle class is getting smaller, the middle class is getting poorer, and there's another characteristic of what happens when a country destroys its money and power gravitates into a central location like the federal government. The power then takes the value or takes the wealth of the middle class. It's automatically transferred to the wealthy. And this is what's been happening. During the bubble formation, Wall Street and the banks, they did quite well during the housing bubble. And then they got to gambling. They got to gambling with these derivatives, and they got themselves over their head. They went bankrupt. And then they come rushing for help to the government and the Federal Reserve and say that you got to bail us out. We're too big to fail. We're too big to fail. The whole economy is going to come down if you don't help us. So what did they do? The Congress and the Federal Reserve bailed them out. And what happened to the bad debt that should be liquidated? The bad debt was dumped on the people. That is what happened. And the very people that were supposed to be helped with these government programs and easy credit so everybody would have a house, guess what? They lost their jobs and they lost their houses, and they're still suffering. Economic planning doesn't work unless it's done by the people, not by the government or central bank. But we have a system today based on entitlements, and it's based on the assumption that some people have a tough time and we have to help them out. And the bleeding hearts say, look, if you don't want to help the people, that means you're heartless, you don't care about people, you're not a humanitarian. But I've come to the conclusion that the humanitarian instincts of almost all people, whether they disagree on solutions, but we have humanitarian instincts that if the humanitarian instinct drives you to say that we are going to have forced redistribution of wealth, guess what? There's not as much wealth. The humanitarian instinct should drive us to the free market, to property rights and sound money and limited government and less war. Then you will help the maximum number of people, and you will have the largest, wealthiest middle class under those conditions. Like a good word. It sounds like a right, but the use of the word entitlement today isn't. That means some people believe they're entitled to what you make and earn and produce. But you don't have a right to somebody else's property, but you should have a right and be entitled to keep what you earn. That's what we need. We want you to be able to the entitlement system is so sold to the masses, and the masses believe they're going to always be taken care of, and you're going to have free education and free houses and free medical care. The whole works. And guess what? The entitlement system is built to really help the very wealthy who know how to manipulate the system. And the poor end up with the crumbs, although they were talked into accepting the entitlement system because they thought they were going to get the help necessary. But today, there is a challenge going on because they talk about the wealthy, and I already have, and criticize those who get bailed out, and the very wealthy who benefit from the destruction of money and through the inflationary system. But you don't want to throw out everybody who's wealthy. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy if you earn your money honestly. That's a big difference. In a free market, the wealthy get wealthy because they deliver a service to the people. If we make an individual wealthy because they provide a good product, and we vote for that product, and they become wealthy, but they get no benefits. They get nothing special from the government, no bailouts, no contracts, anything. They should be entitled to keep that. But those who are in the military-industrial complex or in the financial system that benefits from the monetary system that we have, they're not entitled to that. They don't deserve the bailouts, and they should be challenged, so we have to sort out the two. If we do that, I believe we can return to a much more prosperous economy where we can have growth and jobs once again. The entitlement system is wasteful, and it encourages corruption. A lot of people complain about the lobbyists having control, and they do. There's too much control by lobbyists in Washington. But the lobbyist is a consequence. They are the symptom of the problem, because lobbying is something that is encouraged by the fact that the government's running an auction. You know, H.L. Mencken said it was an auction off of stolen goods, and that's what the government does. So people have an incentive. The business people, everybody has an incentive to go to Washington because there's this redistribution of wealth, and they have this incentive. Now, what we have to do is get the power out of Washington, get the money out of Washington. You won't have the incentive to go up and try to buy this power and control. But today, we have a system that has been totally undermined, and the special interests do have control of it. But another way we could solve this, if we, once again, had only those people who were dedicated to the Constitution, who weren't influenced by these special interests and couldn't be bought off, this would all come to an end as well. Some people ask me once in a while, well, didn't the lobbyists come to you and lobby you? And I said, well, on occasion they did, but they found out that it didn't do any good, you know. But the system of entitlements is something that has to be addressed, but the other thing that I talk about a whole lot, and the place where I want to do the first cutting, because I do want to start, with a token cut in the first year of $1 trillion in 1 year. But even though our system of government in the last 40, 50, 60 years has conditioned so many to be so dependent on government, and some are tragically dependent on government. When you think of the elderly dependent on medical care and the children dependent on medical care, I don't believe that is the place where you start to cut. You don't start to cut on the food stamp program because the conditions have been created by bad government. So I want to work our way out of it. I want to have priorities. So where my priorities are to cut the big bucks are the dollars that we spend so foolishly overseas. In the last 10 years, our national debt had an additional $4 trillion added to it just from the spending overseas. Just think if we had had those strict constitutionalists that I long for in Washington, where we would only go to war with a declaration of war and no other way. of the founders of the country and the revolutionaries against the British. And the king would go to war, and then they would get taxed to pay for the wars. So we need to go to war only if there's a declaration. If there's a need to it and to defend this country, we should declare the war as we did in World War II. Go fight and win it and just come home. That's what we need to do. Just think of the difference. World War II, fighting two huge nations, Germany and Japan. In less than 4 years, they were defeated. And yet here we are. We're in Afghanistan, and believe it, we're not out of Iraq yet. I'll tell you, we're in a mess in there, looking to go into Syria and Iran. It's just constant. But we've been doing this for 10 years. It makes no sense whatsoever, but if we had only gone with a declaration of war, we wouldn't have gone into these wars since, it's Korea, Vietnam, and everything since have been gone basically by the executive branch. So, if you decide that I'm going to be an executive branch, I will not go to war without a proper directive from the people and the U.S. Congress. The policemen of the world. We should not be involved in the internal affairs of other nations. And we certainly should not go to war under a UN resolution either. But there's always reasons to go to war, and sometimes the reasons they give us are not true. Some people call those lies. But certainly the conditions under which we went into Iraq, they turned out, they were not true, and many of us knew they wouldn't be true. But I'll tell you what, things are not a lot different right now. Even though the war drums are beating hard to go to Syria and go to Iran, it's very, very similar to what was happening on the preparation to go into Iraq. The Iraqi war was planned many years before. The first talk in the House floor I ever gave was in 1998, believing that there was war coming, and I was trying to head it off. But that didn't happen until after 9/11. 9/11, a terrible day in our history, but I think it's been misunderstood. I do not believe that we were attacked, nor will we be attacked because we're free and prosperous. I do not believe that is the reason. But when there is a crisis, whether it's an economic crisis that requires us to bail out those in privileged positions, or when we have an international crisis like 9/11, it's used as an excuse to do the very things they've been wanting to do all along. Of course, it turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Guess what? There's Al-Qaeda in Iraq today. And this whole idea that, well, we have to go wherever they are. The terrorists are everywhere. And there are Taliban everywhere. We have to kill every Taliban. But you know, the Taliban are not the Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda are radical enough and they're incensed enough that they want to come here and they do want to kill us because of the problems that we've had with our foreign policy. The Taliban are people who want to, just foreigners off their land, whether they're the Soviets or whether it's the United States or the French or the British. They just want to be left alone. And if we're going to try to... But just think how fruitless that is. If they are defending their homeland and we're trying to kill them and they want to kill us because we're there, the more we go in, the more Taliban there's going to be. The more the people it's a catch-22. There's no ending to it. That is why the non-interventionist foreign policy of the founders makes so much sense. Let them deal with their problems. We'll deal with our problems here at home. say, well, they write us off quickly and say, oh, you're a bunch of isolationists. You don't want to deal with the world. But you know what? It's exactly the opposite. Guess who the isolationists are? The isolationists are the ones who want to put sanctions on all these countries to punish them. And what do? They really punish them and have an overthrow government? They solidify the power and bring out their own nationalism. So when we try to punish the Iranians, we solidify the power of Ahmadinejad. It does the opposite. I don't know whether they do it on purpose or they just don't know what they're doing, but it isn't good. It doesn't work. And but sanctions is a part of the isolationism that they accuse us of. And because the founders and what I believe is that we should be friends with as many people as we can, trade with people, and travel with people around the world. Matter of fact, I think it's about time we remove the sanctions from Cuba. Why can't we travel to Cuba? On Cuba for 50 years and the Castros are still there. It didn't work very well. But I'll tell you what, in the theory behind what the founders thought and what free markets describe is that when you're free, having free trade and market, there's a self-interest involved to stay that way and not fight each other. You know, we were fighting the communists, we were fighting the Chinese, we were fighting the Vietnamese communists, and of course that war went very poorly. We lost that war. We came home. 1 million Vietnamese died, and 60,000 Americans died, but we had to come home. And they warned us. They said there would be this horrible, horrible thing. There would be a domino effect, and the communists would take over the whole world. Well, guess what? It must be free markets that moved in that direction, left our country, because now our banker's in China. So it hasn't worked all that well. But just think now. We do trade and talk to China under imperfect situations, but just think, we're not killing each other. When I was in high school, you know, we were killing each other. A teacher of mine went off to Korea and didn't come back. It made no sense to me. But what about Vietnam? Now we trade with them. We invest over there. They come over here. Imperfect, we're imperfect, they're imperfect. But just think how much more was achieved in peace, which was never achieved in all that fighting for 20 years. The atmosphere that surrounds war, and various kinds of wars, whether it's the wars overseas, or the atmosphere dealing with civil liberties here at home, when you have another war that goes on against the American people that causes so much trouble and so much undermining of our civil liberties, that is that onerous war on drugs that has caused so much trouble. Now the war on drugs has been going on. The modern day war on drugs has occurred since the early 1970s. There was a more minimal war prior to that, but prior to 1912, there was no war on drugs, and a lot of people survived. You know, even in those years when they could go out and buy whatever they wanted. But the war on drugs is very, very dangerous. But the war on drugs is, matter of fact, drugs are very, very dangerous. But the war on drugs, I think, is more dangerous than the drugs themselves. Now, I do want to make a very strong point, both as a physician, as a parent, and as a grandparent. All drugs are dangerous. Illegal drugs are dangerous. The war on drugs are dangerous. But prescription drugs are very dangerous as well. But certainly if we would follow the rules about giving more prerogatives to the states, some states now are just making token efforts to say that people who smoke marijuana for medical reasons should be allowed to. A few states have passed laws that way. What happens? We have the heavy hand of the federal government coming down. They undo this whole principle of states' rights and say that we will tell you what you can do. And our federal government has been known to arrest sick people in wheelchairs, individuals who are getting benefits from marijuana, and putting them in prison. That makes no sense whatsoever. But the real harm done by the war on drugs, and we can't dismiss the fact that drugs are very dangerous, but the real danger is the undermining of our personal civil liberties, because that is used as an excuse to invade our homes without search warrants. A long time, but it's gotten much worse with this other law that was passed after 9/11, and that is called the Patriot Act, which should be repealed. The Patriot Act, as I have said in the debates, is very unpatriotic. The Patriot Act was passed, and that bill was floating around for a long time, and that was an opportunity to pass it and get a bill out there that they wanted to pass all along. But, you know, if they would have called that bill Repeal the Fourth Amendment Act, maybe it wouldn't have passed. That if you see a bill and you see the name on a bill going through the Congress, the name is almost always opposite of what it's going to end up doing. You know, so it's a very bad piece of legislation. So I think next year, when we get this opportunity to change some of these things, we should call it. We shouldn't call it repeal the Patriot Act. What we should do is let's restore the Fourth Amendment Act. But it is the Patriot Act that gives cover to many times the SWAT teams had been coming into our homes and into our apartments, breaking in without proper search warrants. Now they can do it wholesale. And lo and behold, I imagine you have heard, there's a few occasions when they actually go into the wrong homes, and they've actually killed the wrong people. They shouldn't even be doing it, but it is out of control. They'll march into our homes without the proper authority, and the Fourth Amendment was supposed to guarantee that we would not be invaded by our government without a proper search warrant. That has encouraged those individuals that are supposed to be protecting us, our airports, but what did they do? They prod and poke and x-ray us without any proper permission either. So someday we can think up a better way to protect us at the airports without the TSA. About a year ago, the President sent somebody over to the Senate, and he announced new policy. And the new policy was that the President, under his understanding, as being the Commander-in-Chief, he could assassinate American citizens. Now, he explained it constitutionally. He said that he's the Commander-in-Chief. And if it's not prohibited in the Constitution, he's allowed to do anything he wants. I think he has that flipped around a little bit. He's supposed to be able to do only the things that he has the explicit authority to do, not the other way around. So he went and proved his point. He's already now assassinated 3 Americans. Well, the first one, Al-Awlaki, probably a bad guy, even though they never made any charges. They never had a trial. They never said he did anything. But he probably was associated with some bad actors. He wasn't in this country, so they said, we're going to go after him, and with a drone missile, they killed him. So he had no due process. But they said that another family member was an associated force, associated with him, so therefore he was guilty too. So the next week, they assassinated him. But it turned out he was 16 years old, barbecuing in the backyard with his cousin. I don't think that's what America is supposed to be all about at all. I think we have to have more respect for civil liberties in this country. And of course, the Congress is not much better. The presidents take too much power. The Congress encourages the president. They've done it, with the war on drugs. And also, just in December, they passed a bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. And it's obvious that you know a little bit about that. I'm always impressed by that. Because I know you didn't hear about it on the evening news. That's what I'm sure of. The Congress gave the president the authority to arrest any American citizen who is an associated force, maybe website, attending a meeting, having emails, or whatever. Just be loosely associated with somebody, you can be charged. But arrested by the military, which violates Posse Comitatus, that's essentially been repealed. And you can be arrested, denied an attorney, denied charges, denied a trial, and put in a secret prison indefinitely. And that's what the law says. If we want to live in a republic, we can't allow this stuff to stay on the books. We gotta stand up and say, enough is enough. We need to change this and quit doing this to us. These issues for a long time, and in the last 4 or 5 years, the country has become alive with this because of the great concern about our debt and our foreign policy and our civil liberties. But the great thing is that there are certain groups coming together right now who are really standing up for these values. One is a group of people who have known about these views for a long time, have felt frustrated, they've sort of dropped out, discussed it with both parties, and maybe never voted again, but now they're coming in and they're getting excited about a different view on government. But also, there's a young group of people now graduating into the adulthood who now, in the college age group, are enthusiastic about these views. That's what gets me excited. Has been fantastic in the 50s and the 60s when I was looking for information, trying to sort these things out. It wasn't all that easy. I mean, I certainly couldn't get it off the TV. I certainly couldn't get it from my government. I couldn't get it from my government schools. But there were just a few people who were holding together and expressing these views. But today, we don't have that handicap. Today, we have a very, very public secret weapon, that is the Internet. Those who are in charge fear the Internet because, it's a powerful weapon. And they've already been working very hard on clamping down on the Internet. And this Stop Online Piracy Act was a very, very bad bill. And let's be grateful that's been taken off the docket. Give us encouragement when the people wake up and send a message. Even those individuals in Washington who are sound asleep get the message because they were getting onto that bill wholesale. They had the votes and it was about to come to the floor. The people like you woke up and sent messages out there. So we still have enough freedom to wake this country up and change the direction, but it has to come from the people. It won't come top down. It has to come from the people because government reflects the values of the people. So if that's what you want and you speak out and you do your job, Washington will change. My personal convictions are that the goals ought to be very very plain. Living in a free society is what I want. I've always been convinced that even if I lived in a free society and didn't have as much wealth, I still want to live in a free society. Fortunately for us, we don't have to make that decision. The freer society, the richer the society. The bigger the middle class and the more wealth there is, the better the distribution. So we never have to be bashful when the so-called humanitarians say, well, you who believe in the free market and capitalism, you don't care about people. If you care about people, you will defend liberty, you'll defend the free markets and sound money and no special interest out of the U.S. government to the special purpose. But it is the freedom that we want. I think that the goal, the results then would be that it is our best effort to have peace in the world. Wars really drain. You cannot fight these kind of wars and expect to have wealth back here at home. Wars have to stop. Only defensive wars. That is the only thing proper. That's what the Constitution says. You can't start wars. So striving for peace and then bringing about the reforms necessary for the economic system to change, this is where the prosperity comes from. But then we have this other item about how we get along with each other. And we haven't done a real good job. Over the years, for many years, we have picked out certain groups in our society and they have been punished. They have been unfairly treated. And to some degree that still exists. And I complain about how the drug laws are enforced. You know, if you're poor and a minority, you're more likely to be punished than if you're rich and you're white. That's just the facts of life. But what we need to do is understand that freedom, when you realize it, it brings people together. Some people defend economic freedom and say, yes, we need good economic freedoms and marketplaces and low taxes and capitalism, and they do pretty well on that. But then they drift over and they go into the special interests. They want to use redistribution, so they're really not all that great all the time on the free market. Then there's another group saying, well, what we want to do is protect personal liberty, but not economic liberty. But if you understand what liberty is all about, that it's individual. We get it from our Creator in a natural way, and our rights are natural to us, that it's the freedom that we want. It's not the decision on how we're going to use this freedom, because each and every one of us might use it differently. So we shouldn't tell other people how they're going to use their freedom, but you say, well, they might waste their money. Well, that should be their problem. They waste their money. Responsibility to deciding what is good for you, what you put in your body, your mouth, and your social values. Yes, some of that is very, very dangerous, but you should suffer the consequences. But once you have government doing this, where they're trying to protect you from yourself economically or by your personal habits, there's nothing left to freedom when government's telling you what to do to protect you from yourself. So the responsibility falls on us. We have to assume this responsibility. That doesn't mean we don't care. We don't endorse the way people use their freedom. If they use it, if they follow a religion we don't like, that doesn't mean you have to endorse it. We don't endorse it. So if people have a lifestyle you don't like, you just say, well, that's their business, and you write it off. But you don't have to be judgmental. And this to me is the reason people to come together, and they're diverse, because we want one thing. We want our right to our lives and our liberty. We want our freedom, and this should bring people together. So this is the reason. Wonderful critical part about liberty is bringing people together. We knew and understood this for a long time. We did have this. It was a great test. It was the best test in the history of mankind. And yet, freedom is a very young issue. People keep thinking, well, you're going back to the Dark Ages, back to the Dark Ages of the gold standard. I'll tell you what's Dark Ages, and that's tyranny. We don't want to go back to tyranny. We want to advance forward with liberty. So this is the reason that we have this wonderful opportunity. Yes, it's tough times. We have tough economic times. We're in perpetual war. We have this inevitable debt crisis that's bearing down. But the solution's out there. And it's not like we have to invent something new. It's not like it's brand new. It's not my idea. I try my best to bring this together. I don't want to go back to any dark age. I want to pick up the pieces we were and improve on it. Improve on the gold standard. Improve on how we bring people together. Improve on the understanding how free markets work and why it's important that we don't think wealth comes out of a printing press run by the Federal Reserve. A lot of these things are, rather logical, but we have to get that message out. People have to believe it's in their best interest to argue for a free society. So basically, we have an obligation to ourselves to read and understand and to be able to defend these positions. Because I am sincere. I do think governments are a reflection of the people. And right now, the people are changing, and that's where the encouragement is. So I come here with a positive note of saying that there's every reason in the world to believe the world is changing for the better, even though we face great dangers and we have to do something about it, but we can win if we can galvanize people and understand this is an intellectual revolution. This is truly a revolution that's going on. Been argued that an idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by armies or by government. I'm convinced of that too. Ideas are powerful. Ideas have consequences. Good and correct ideas have good and correct consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences. Let's argue the case for good ideas and the principles of liberty, and we can work our way out of this and restore the greatness of America.